We have to discuss why Shedeur Sanders fell as far as he did. But before we do, Ryan, he ends up with the Cleveland Browns in the 5th round as pick 144. I'm trying to wrap my head around this because yesterday on day 2, they selected Dillon Gabriel from Oregon. Lots of conflicting visions here, lots of confusing overall moves in order to round out their quarterback room because they already have Kenny Pickett and Joe Flacco. First and foremost, how do you make sense of the fit for Shedeur Sanders here?
Well, I mean, just strictly for the fit, I don't hate Shedeur Sanders in Cleveland necessarily. I actually think he's a pretty good fit as far as like the Kevin Stefanski offense, right? Like it's heavy play action, a little bit of movement based. He's a smooth player inside of the pocket. I like the understanding of how he could potentially fit there. Obviously, there's a lot of things to unpack with this conversation though, but generally speaking, accurate quarterback, good off of play action, pretty smooth inside of the pocket. I don't mind him in Kevin Stefanski's offense personally, Joe.
Yeah, I think that overall, for like talking about like how he's going to play with, he could start for this team. Like, let's forget anyone who's going to jump in the comments and say like, oh, he's overrated, all those things. Forget about that for a second. Yep. His skill set, the accuracy, the ability to throw on the run, the touch, the timing, the overall decision making, it's on film. Those are his strengths. He's not a big-armed, massive quarterback who's going to run in the 4.4s. Right. Kirk Cousins has been an indirect comparison for Shedeur Sanders. Kirk Cousins worked with Kevin Stefanski in Minnesota, not the most physically dominant quarterback, and he worked well with the way that they established the run and then set up the pass game off it. I think Shedeur Sanders can work really nicely, but now we have to ask ourselves, what the heck is the quarterback hierarchy? Can he eventually steal that top starting job maybe after year 1, or is this a battle for him to just straight up make the roster?
Well, I mean, it's a battle for someone to not make the roster because you have 4 quarterbacks on the roster now not named Deshaun Watson, right? Like, we're not including Deshaun Watson in this conversation with everything that's going on with him. But you traded for Kenny Pickett. You gave up capital to go get Kenny Pickett. I know it wasn't a crazy high valuation, but you still went out of your way and mortgaged something in order to bring him to Cleveland. Then you get Joe Flacco in here. I would assume that Joe Flacco on like the cheap veteran conversation, like maybe he's a replaceable player if the couple of the young guys are ready to go. But drafting a Dillon Gabriel who projects best as a long-term backup in the 3rd round and then drafting a kid probably with a higher upside, well, not probably, a higher upside 2 rounds later, it's just really muffled. Like, do one of these rookie quarterbacks not make the roster? Is it possible that Dillon Gabriel, although he went in the 3rd round, doesn't end up making the roster? Do you let go of Joe Flacco? Like, I have no idea what the next step is here for Cleveland, Joe. This is going to be a soap opera for the rest of the offseason now.
I know. I don't like it for that reason. Like, you're already going to get all this attention for having drafted Shedeur Sanders, and now you're going to create all this extra drama of trying to figure out who actually sticks and stays in Cleveland. So there's all of that to navigate. I would imagine somebody, if not maybe 2 of the faces in this quarterback room end up getting traded. Like, that is very plausible to happen here. But we have to talk about, now that he's been picked, what happens or what happened to this point? What caused him to fall? And I think that there's a lot of things to speculate. We can talk about all the rumors about how he handled himself in the interviews. There was one interview that apparently he took a FaceTime call and he didn't hang up the phone call. He continued the call that he took in the middle of the interview and then proceeded to finish the interview. That came out on Twitter today. The one thought that I had about this and why he didn't go early is that if we look back to the coverage of Shedeur Sanders, he has been just put under a massive microscope, and there is a wide range of negative and positive reactions to his performances. Him falling is the perfect example of that. If you were the team that drafted Shedeur Sanders early and you're going to have to deal with Deion Sanders and his brothers chiming in on anything that happens,
right?
If that pick didn't work out and Shedeur Sanders ends up being unsuccessful as a 1st or a 2nd round pick, you are going to then be the most negative headline in the NFL. You are going to get so much negative attention that you wasted a pick on Shedeur Sanders. Your team is not successful with Shedeur Sanders, and everyone is going to talk about how Shedeur Sanders was a bust, one of the bigger busts of all time, all of these things. So him going in the 5th round, it makes a lot more sense for these teams that don't want to have to deal with that don't want to have to deal with the circus. And theoretically, as we just mentioned a second ago, if they don't think Shedeur really wows them, they can cut a 5th-round pick. They could cut a 5th-round pick and move on, or they could trade a 5th-round pick and move on and not feel like it is going to impact how people are going to discuss them.
And it's a lot more from a just outside perspective. It is a lot. It's not as negative of a thing as far as perception if you cut a 5th-rounder versus if you cut a 3rd-rounder, right? Of Dillon Gabriel potentially. It's just really an odd situation overall. Just to kind of rehash quickly, something that I heard was that in some of these meetings, or a decent amount of these meetings, apparently Deion Sanders himself was also there with Shedeur in what is supposed to be more of a not a one-on-one setting, but it's supposed to be a one person to a group setting ultimately, right? So I just think when you're drafting Shedeur Sanders, you're not just drafting Shedeur Sanders. You're drafting the family, you're drafting the attention, and sometimes the circus that all comes with it. So I do think that that is part of the reason that I think some teams were hesitant to pull the trigger, obviously much earlier than this. So if you're Cleveland, there's going to be a lot of attention on you this offseason. And how this ends up, I have no idea. This could be Kenny Pickett, Joe Flacco, Shedeur Sanders quarterback room. You could switch out Sanders for Dillon Gabriel. Maybe you cut Flacco and keep both rookies. I have no idea exactly what it's going to look like, Joe, but it is certainly going to be fascinating to watch.
And at the end of the day, I think that like with him specifically and like people trying to understand like what could have possibly have gone wrong in these interviews with these teams, we have to realize that what he has had around him for the last couple of years. I am not calling the Deion Sanders and the Sanders family a bad family. That's not what I'm saying here. But he, out of any prospect, this has never happened before, where a guy coming up from high school to an FCS program to a Power 4 program, every step of the way, he has had his dad there leading him. Has anyone yelled at him other than his dad in that period of time? Because I would argue the way that everybody responds to negative comments about Shedeur Sanders, the way that there is a gang up, I don't think that anyone really has. When was the last time that you really heard a quote from Shedeur Sanders in a press conference? It's always coming from Deion Sanders. So I think that NFL teams, when you go into these interviews, you're trying to see how a player is going to react when you put pressure on him. There's a lot of times why we hear about these interviews that players say that they're asked really weird, uncomfortable questions. It's kind of like if you're interviewing for private equity. If you're going into a job field that is high pressure and a lot of work and a demand of your time, and it is going to put a lot of stress on you, they want to see how you're going to respond to that. So I feel as though that this wasn't so much that he came off as pompous and entitled, as more so he just didn't come off as a guy that they thought was going to be able to handle all this, because since high school, he's not been his own man. He's been surrounded by his father, and we're going to have to see if the Browns are going to be able to unlock something from him, or if he just ends up being a roster casualty and somebody ends up picking him up after the preseason's over.
Man, there really is that fine line, though. Like, if it is a pompous versus a confident attitude perspective, we do know that confidence is great. Pompous, being a little bit entitled, like those things are where you start to lose confidence from people ultimately, right? And he is a person that has always had that spotlight, and he has the swagger to him, which is a good thing at times. But in other circumstances, you're right. He hasn't been asked to sink or swim yet. He hasn't been thrown into the deep end and really asked to do something without his full family and full support behind him on a very micro level at this point. So this is the first time we're going to see Shedeur Sanders by himself. What does he look like from an individual perspective? How much can he acclimate to Cleveland, the city? Because you know that also, that's a tough city, man. Like the dog pound is they're not easy, right? Like they need to be won over a little bit. Can Shedeur Sanders by himself win over the city of Cleveland? That remains to be seen.
Folks, comment below if you think Shedeur Sanders could eventually become the starting quarterback for the Browns. Hit that like button and subscribe. We'll talk to you later.